Imagine receiving a letter from a friend, a normal letter asking about everyday things. And then, at the very end, almost casually, they mention that enemy warships have appeared on the horizon, that the city is surrounded, that help isn't coming, and that's the last thing they ever write. That letter exists. It's a clay tablet, baked hard in the fire that destroyed the city where it was found. It was written by the king of Ugarit, a wealthy port city on the coast of what's now Syria, sometime around 1190 BCE. The tablet was addressed to the king of Alashia, modern Cyprus, and it describes a desperate situation. My father, now the enemy's ships have come. They have set fire to my cities and have done evil things in my country. My father, did you not know that all my troops and chariots are stationed in Hatti and all my ships are in Lycia? They have not yet returned, and the country is abandoned. Consider this, my father. There are 7 enemy ships that have come and done much damage. The tablet was never sent. It was found in the ruins of Ugarit's royal palace, which was violently destroyed shortly after this message was written. The city was never rebuilt. It was abandoned and eventually forgotten, buried under sand for 3,000 years. This wasn't an isolated incident. Around the same time this letter was being written, the entire Bronze Age world was collapsing, not declining gradually, not transforming slowly, collapsing catastrophically and suddenly. Within the span of about 50 years, from roughly 1200 to 1150 BCE, almost every major civilization in the eastern Mediterranean was destroyed or severely damaged. The Hittite Empire, which had controlled Anatolia for centuries, simply ceased to exist. Its capital was burned and abandoned. The Mycenaean palace civilization of Greece fell into ruin. Dozens of cities across the Mediterranean were violently destroyed. Writing systems vanished. International trade networks that had functioned for centuries broke down completely. Population levels plummeted. Historians call this the Bronze Age collapse, and it remains one of the most dramatic and mysterious events in human history. In terms of civilizational disruption, it was worse than the fall of Rome. The Mediterranean world wouldn't recover its previous level of complexity for 3 to 4 centuries. What happened? That's what we're going to explore. In this video, we'll understand what the late Bronze Age world looked like before the AO collapse, how interconnected and sophisticated it actually was. We'll follow the cascade of destruction, kingdom by kingdom, city by city. We'll examine what modern archaeology reveals about the causes, from climate data preserved in tree rings to chemical analysis of destruction layers. We'll look at why some places survived while others vanished. And we'll consider what this ancient catastrophe might teach us about our own interconnected world. This isn't just ancient history. It's a story about what happens when complex systems fail, about how civilization, once it reaches a certain level of interconnection, becomes simultaneously more powerful and more fragile. To understand how catastrophic the collapse was, we first need to understand what was lost. So let's go back to the late Bronze Age at its height, to a world that was, in many ways, surprisingly modern. The late Bronze Age, roughly 1400 to 1200 BCE, was an era of unprecedented internationalism. The major powers of the Eastern Mediterranean, Egypt, the Hittite Empire, Mycenaean Greece, the Mitanni, Assyria, Babylon, and various kingdoms in Cyprus and the Levant, were connected through a complex web of diplomacy, trade, and occasional warfare. We know this because they left records. Lots of them. In 1887, a woman digging for fertilizer in the ruins of Amarna, Egypt, discovered a cache of clay tablets. These turned out to be diplomatic correspondence, letters between the Egyptian pharaohs Amenhotep III and Akhenaten and rulers across the Near East. The Amarna letters, as they're now called, reveal a sophisticated diplomatic system with established protocols, gift exchanges, dynastic marriages, and constant communication. Kings addressed each other as brother, even when they weren't related. They complained when gifts weren't sufficiently impressive. They arranged marriages between royal families. They requested specific trade goods, gold, horses, timber, luxury items. They discussed military alliances and, threats. One letter from the king of Alashia, Cyprus, to the Egyptian pharaoh apologizes for not sending copper because a plague had struck his land. Another, from a Canaanite king, begs Egypt for military help against enemies. The king of Babylon complains that the gifts Egypt sent weren't real gold. These weren't primitive societies. They had bureaucracies, standardized weights and measures, professional diplomats, and international trade networks that stretched from Afghanistan, source of lapis lazuli, to Britain, source of tin. Trade was extensive and specialized. Egypt exported gold and grain. Cyprus exported copper. It was the Bronze Age's primary copper source, essential for making bronze. The Levantine coast exported cedar wood and purple dye. Mycenaean Greece exported olive oil, wine, and crafted goods. Anatolia exported silver and horses. Ships moved constantly between ports. A single shipwreck discovered off the coast of Turkey at Uluburun, dating to around 1300 BCE, contained cargo from at least 7 different cultures: copper ingots from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan, ebony from Africa, ivory from Syria, glass ingots from Mesopotamia, Mycenaean pottery, Canaanite jars, and Egyptian gold. This ship wasn't unusual. It was normal Bronze Age commerce. Cities were large and wealthy. Ugarit, the city whose last letter we read earlier, had a population of perhaps 10,000 in the city itself, and maybe 25,000, including surrounding villages. It had a palace, temples, wealthy merchant houses, archives full of tablets in multiple languages, and a sophisticated harbor. Hattusa, capital of the Hittite Empire in central Anatolia, covered about 400 acres at its peak. Its fortifications were massive, stone walls with towers, elaborate gates decorated with carved lions and sphinxes. The city had a sophisticated water management system, temples to dozens of gods, and administrative buildings full of clay tablet archives. Mycenaean palaces in Greece, Mycenae, Pylos, Tyrans, were centers of bureaucratic control. They kept detailed records of everything: inventory lists, ration distributions, religious offerings, craft production. We have tablets listing hundreds of workers, shepherds, bronzesmiths, textile workers, perfume makers, charioteers. This was a literate, organized, complex world, and then, in the span of 2 or 3 generations, most of it was destroyed. The collapse didn't happen everywhere at once. It was a cascade, with destruction spreading across the Mediterranean over several decades. But the speed was still shocking by historical standards. The first signs of trouble appear around 1250 BCE. Tree ring data from this period, taken from ancient timbers across the Mediterranean and Near East, shows a dramatic decline in growth rates. Trees grow less when there's less rainfall. The data indicates that a severe drought began around 1250 BCE and lasted for decades, perhaps a century or more. Climate scientists who study this period describe it as a mega-drought, comparable to the worst droughts of the past 2,000 years. Rainfall levels may have dropped by 20–30% across the eastern Mediterranean. In agricultural societies completely dependent on rainfall, this would have been catastrophic. We see evidence of the crisis in texts. A letter from the king of the Hittites to the king of Ugarit, dated to around 1230 BCE, is blunt. There is a severe famine in your country. There is no grain to save their lives. I'm dispatching grain ships to you. Another text, from the same period, describes the Hittite king ordering massive grain shipments from Egypt. Send me quickly, because in this country the people are dying of hunger. But environmental stress alone doesn't necessarily cause civilizational collapse. Droughts had happened before. What made this one different was what else was happening simultaneously. Around 1200 BCE, destruction begins to spread. The first major kingdom to fall was the Hittite Empire. This is particularly striking because the Hittites had been a superpower for over 3 centuries. They had fought Egypt to a standstill at the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BCE. They controlled most of Anatolia and parts of Syria. They had professional armies, sophisticated diplomacy, and vast resources. But around 1200 BCE, Hattusa, the capital, was violently destroyed. The destruction was thorough. The palace burned, temples were ruined, the archives were baked hard in the fires. The city was abandoned and never reoccupied. We don't know exactly who destroyed Hattusa. There are no records of the actual attack because the archives end abruptly. One moment the tablets record normal administrative activities, grain distributions, religious festivals, diplomatic correspondence. Then nothing. The last tablets from Hattusa show signs of internal crisis. There are texts about rebellions in outlying territories, orders to fortify cities, desperate letters requesting military aid. The Empire was already weakening when the final blow came. After Hattusa fell, Hittite control collapsed across Anatolia. Secondary cities were destroyed or abandoned. The complex administrative system that had governed the empire simply ceased to function. Within a generation, the Hittite state had vanished so completely that later peoples forgot it had ever existed. The Hittites weren't rediscovered until archaeologists began excavating Hattusa in the early 1900s. Around the same time, destruction spread across the Levant, the coastal region of modern Syria, Lebanon, and Israel. Ugarit, that wealthy port city, was destroyed around 1190 BCE. The destruction was violent. Buildings burned, walls collapsed, people fled or died. Archaeologists excavating the city found arrowheads in the streets, skeletons in houses, and that final unsent letter in the ruins of the palace. Ugarit was never rebuilt. The survivors apparently scattered, and the city was gradually buried under sand. When archaeologists first excavated it in the 1920s, they found the ruins preserved almost exactly as they'd been left 300 years earlier. Nearby cities suffered similar fates. Alalak, Hamath, Hazor, Megiddo, Lachish all show destruction layers dated to this period. Some were rebuilt, but on a smaller scale and with less sophistication. Others were permanently abandoned. In Greece, the Mycenaean palace system collapsed. Mycenae itself was destroyed around 1180 BCE. Pylos burned. Tiryns was abandoned. The elaborate bureaucratic apparatus, all those tablets listing workers and rations, simply stopped. Writing itself disappeared from Greece. The linear B script used to record Mycenaean Greek vanished and wouldn't be deciphered again until the 1950s. Greece entered what's called the Greek Dark Ages, a period lasting over 3 centuries during which population declined dramatically, settlement sizes shrank, international trade ceased, and material culture became vastly simpler. Cyprus saw massive destruction. Multiple cities were burned. Some were rebuilt, but the character of the island's civilization changed fundamentally. Even Egypt, the most resilient of the major powers, faced severe crisis. Ramesses III, who ruled from 1186 to 1155 BCE, fought off multiple invasions. His mortuary temple at Medinet Habu contains detailed inscriptions and reliefs describing these battles, including the famous depictions of the Sea People's invasion we mentioned earlier. Egypt survived, but at enormous cost. Its treasury was depleted. Its control over territories in Canaan and Syria weakened and then disappeared. Within decades of Ramesses III's death, Egypt fragmented into competing power centers and entered its own period of decline. By 1150 BCE, the interconnected Bronze Age world had shattered. International trade had collapsed. Literacy had declined or vanished in several regions. Cities were smaller, poorer, and less sophisticated. population levels had dropped dramatically. Estimates suggest the population of Greece fell by 75% or more. It was, by any measure, a catastrophe. But what actually caused it? That's where things get complicated. If you're finding this deep dive into ancient catastrophe fascinating, take a moment to drop a like. It helps others discover these stories about how civilizations rise and fall. Now, let's examine what modern science reveals about what actually happened. The question of what caused the Bronze Age collapse has been debated by archaeologists and historians for decades. The challenge is that there's no single cause that explains everything. Instead, the evidence points to multiple factors interacting in complex ways, what scholars call systems collapse. Let's look at the main theories and what evidence supports each one. Theory 1. Climate change and drought. The evidence for severe drought is strong and comes from multiple sources. Dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, provides precise climate data. Trees grow more in wet years and less in dry years, creating a record preserved in their rings. Scientists have analyzed timbers from across the Mediterranean and Near East, including ancient buildings, shipwrecks, and preserved wood in peat bogs. The data shows a clear pattern. Beginning around 1250 BCE, tree growth rates decline sharply. This indicates significantly reduced rainfall. The drought appears to have lasted for decades, possibly over a century. Pollen analysis supports this. Core samples from lake beds show changes in vegetation around this time. Trees that need more water decline, drought-resistant plants increase. Isotope analysis of human and animal remains also indicates dietary stress. When people eat less protein and more grain, it shows up in the chemical composition of their bones. Skeletons from this period show signs of nutritional deficiency. But here's what's important. Drought alone doesn't necessarily cause civilizational collapse. Modern archaeology has documented many cases where Bronze Age societies survived droughts through various strategies: grain storage, trade networks, migration. What made this drought different was probably its duration and the fact that it affected the entire region simultaneously. When drought is localized, trade can compensate. Egypt sends grain to the Hittites, as those letters describe. But when drought affects everyone at once, the system breaks. The interconnected trade network that was normally a strength became a vulnerability. When one region couldn't produce surplus, others couldn't compensate. Theory 2. Earthquakes and natural disasters. Some archaeologists argue that a series of major earthquakes contributed to the collapse. The eastern Mediterranean is seismically active. It sits on the boundary between the African and Eurasian tectonic plates. Evidence for earthquakes comes from destruction layers. At many sites, walls didn't just burn, they collapsed in ways consistent with seismic activity. Columns are displaced. Walls lean or fall outward. Buildings show compression damage. Archaeologist Amos Noor has proposed an earthquake storm hypothesis. The idea that a series of major earthquakes struck the region over several decades, destroying cities and disrupting the carefully maintained irrigation systems, harbors, and fortifications that Bronze Age civilization depended on. Supporting evidence includes multiple cities showing similar patterns of destruction around the same time damage, to fortifications and walls inconsistent with human attack, evidence of rebuilding followed by destruction again, suggesting multiple events, ancient texts mentioning the earth shaking or similar phrases. However, this theory has critics. Not all destruction layers show clear seismic signatures, and earthquakes, while devastating, don't usually cause permanent abandonment. Cities typically rebuild after earthquakes unless other factors prevent recovery. Most likely, earthquakes were one factor. Among several, they may have weakened cities and infrastructure just as drought was causing food stress and political instability. Theory 3. Invasion and warfare. The Sea Peoples. The Egyptian texts about the Sea Peoples describe massive movements of populations, coalitions of groups moving across the Mediterranean, destroying cities and seeking new lands to settle. We discussed the Sea Peoples in the context of the Philistines, but here we need to consider them as potential agents of collapse, rather than just consequences of it. The evidence for violent destruction is clear at many sites. Cities show burn layers, arrowheads are found in the streets. Hasty burials indicate violence. Fortifications were strengthened in the years before destruction, suggesting people knew threats were coming. Egyptian inscriptions are explicit. The foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms. But were the Sea Peoples a cause or a symptom? Modern scholars increasingly think they were both. The drought and economic stress created conditions where large populations became refugees. These refugee groups, desperate and armed, moved across the Mediterranean seeking new homes. Their movements further destabilized the region, destroying cities and disrupting trade networks. It's a feedback loop. Environmental stress causes migration, migration causes warfare and destruction, warfare causes more refugees and more stress. The Sea Peoples didn't cause the collapse. They were part of it. Theory 4. Systems collapse and internal weakness. Some scholars argue that the late Bronze Age system was inherently fragile, despite, or perhaps because of, its complexity and interconnection. The palace economies of the Bronze Age were centralized and bureaucratic. Everything was controlled from the top: agricultural production, craft specialization, trade, military organization. This created efficiency, but also vulnerability. When the palaces fell, whether from earthquake, invasion, drought, or internal rebellion, the entire system they managed collapsed with them. The scribes who kept records fled or died. The bureaucrats who distributed rations disappeared. The merchants who managed long-distance trade were gone. Local communities didn't necessarily have the knowledge or resources to maintain these systems independently. Bronze production, for example, required importing tin from Afghanistan and copper from Cyprus, then having specialized smiths who knew the correct ratios. When the trade networks broke and the smiths fled, communities couldn't maintain bronze production. Writing was controlled by palace scribes. When the palaces fell, literacy declined or vanished because the institutional framework that maintained it was gone. This theory suggests the Bronze Age kingdoms were like modern electrical grids, highly efficient when functioning, but vulnerable to cascading failures. Damage to one part could bring down the whole system. Evidence for internal weakness comes from texts in the decades before collapse. We see signs of labor unrest and strikes. Egyptian texts mention workers striking for unpaid rations, piracy increasing along trade routes, rebellions in outlying territories, kings unable to collect taxes or tribute, general administrative breakdown. The system was already stressed before the external shocks hit. The complexity answer. Most archaeologists now think, oh, all these factors worked together. It wasn't drought or earthquakes or invasion or internal weakness. It was all of them, interacting in ways that made each factor worse. Drought stressed food systems. This caused internal unrest and weakened kingdoms' ability to defend themselves. Earthquakes damaged infrastructure just when resources to rebuild were scarce. Weakened kingdoms couldn't resist raiders or refugee groups. Refugee movements disrupted trade further. Trade disruption made it harder to respond to drought, and so on. Complex systems can absorb individual shocks, drought, earthquake, invasion. But when multiple shocks hit simultaneously, the system's ability to adapt is overwhelmed. The centralized palace systems, so efficient in stable conditions, became fatal vulnerabilities in crisis. What makes the Bronze Age collapse particularly fascinating to modern scholars is that it's not unique. History shows other examples of rapid civilizational decline following similar patterns. The classic Maya collapse around 900 CE, the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the collapse of the Khmer Empire. In each case, complex, interconnected societies facing environmental stress and external pressures reached a tipping point where the systems holding them together failed rapidly. Which raises an uncomfortable question for our own time. How fragile is modern civilization? While destruction was widespread, it wasn't universal. Some places survived, and understanding why reveals important patterns. Egypt. Diminished but surviving. Egypt weathered the crisis better than any other major power. Why? Geography helped. Egypt's agricultural system depended on the Nile's annual flood, not rainfall. So while drought devastated Syria, Anatolia, and Greece, Egypt's food supply was more resilient. Egypt also had centralized storage systems. Granaries held surplus from good years. When crisis hit, Egypt had reserves. Militarily, Egypt was strong enough to defeat the Sea Peoples. Invasions. Ramesses III's victories, while costly, prevented Egypt from being overrun. But Egypt didn't escape unscathed. Its empire collapsed. It lost control over Canaan, Syria, and Nubia. Internal problems increased. Within decades of Ramesses III's death, Egypt fragmented into competing power centers and wouldn't reunify for centuries. Egypt survived, but in diminished form. Assyria, the patient survivor. Assyria in northern Mesopotamia also survived. During the Late Bronze Age, Assyria had been a regional power, but not a superpower. It paid tribute to more powerful neighbors. When those neighbors collapsed, Assyria was suddenly in a better position. It hadn't overextended itself. Its agricultural base, dependent on rivers rather than rainfall, was more stable. It had maintained strong military traditions. Over the next few centuries, as the Mediterranean world struggled to recover, Assyria gradually expanded. By 900 BCE, it would become the dominant power in the Near East. The Neo-Assyrian Empire that would eventually conquer Egypt, destroy the Philistine cities, and deport the Israelites. Assyria's survival strategy seemed to be conservative growth and military readiness. It didn't rely on distant trade networks. It maintained control over its core territory and expanded only when it had the resources to do so. Phoenicia, adaptation and innovation. The Phoenician city-states, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, survived the collapse and actually thrived afterward. These cities had been part of the Bronze Age trade network, but they'd maintained more autonomy than palace-controlled cities like Ugarit. They were merchant cities, decentralized and flexible. When the old Bronze Age kingdoms collapsed, the Phoenicians adapted. They couldn't trade with Greece anymore because Greek civilization had collapsed, so they sailed farther, across the Mediterranean to North Africa, Spain, even possibly the Atlantic coast of Europe. Phoenician merchants became the primary traders of the early Iron Age. They founded colonies across the Mediterranean, including Carthage, which would eventually challenge Rome. They developed the alphabet that would become the basis for Greek, Latin, and ultimately our own writing system. The Phoenicians survived by being adaptable rather than centralized, entrepreneurial rather than bureaucratic. The pattern of survival. Looking at who survived and who didn't reveals patterns. Centralized palace economies with rigid hierarchies tended to collapse. Completely, Hittites, Mycenaeans, societies with diverse adaptable economies survived better. Phoenicia. Dependence on long-distance trade for essentials was a fatal vulnerability. Geographic advantages mattered. Stable water sources, defensive positions, military strength helped, but wasn't sufficient alone. The survivors weren't necessarily the strongest or richest. They were the most adaptable and the least dependent on the complex systems that failed. The Bronze Age collapse led to what archaeologists call the Iron Age, not because the date changed arbitrarily, but because the technology that dominated changed. Bronze requires copper and tin. Tin especially had to be imported from distant sources, Afghanistan, possibly Britain. When long-distance trade networks collapsed, bronze became harder to produce. Iron, on the other hand, can be made from iron ore, which is much more widely available. Iron-working technology had existed during the Bronze Age, but iron was rare and expensive, harder to work than bronze. But when access to tin became unreliable, incentives changed. Communities that could work iron had a major advantage. Iron technology spread rapidly during and after the collapse. Ironically, the collapse that destroyed Bronze Age civilization also democratized metal technology. Bronze had been controlled by palace workshops. Iron could be worked by village smiths. The collapse also changed political organization. The great centralized kingdoms were gone. In Sati, their place, smaller, more decentralized societies emerged. The early Greek city-states, the Phoenician merchant cities, the tribal kingdoms of Israel and Judah, the Aramean city-states of Syria. These societies were less complex, less literate, less bureaucratic, but they were also more resilient, more adaptable, and eventually more innovative. The alphabet developed in this period, a much simpler writing system than the complex syllabaries of the Bronze Age. Trade recovered, but in different patterns. New technologies emerged. Recovery took centuries. Population levels wouldn't return to Bronze Age peaks until the Classical period, 500 BCE or later in some regions. But the world that emerged from the collapse was, in many ways, the foundation of classical civilization. Greece would emerge from its dark ages to create the civilization that produced democracy, philosophy, and classical art. Phoenician traders would connect the Mediterranean world in new ways. The kingdoms that emerged in the Levant, including Israel, would produce religious and cultural innovations that continue to shape the world today. The collapse destroyed a civilization, but it also cleared the way for new ones to emerge. If this exploration of how ancient interconnected systems failed is making you think about modern parallels, consider subscribing. We regularly examine these kinds of overlooked historical patterns. Now, let's talk about what this ancient catastrophe might mean for us. So what have we learned from 3,000 years of archaeological detective work into the Bronze Age collapse? First, we've learned that even sophisticated, powerful civilizations can collapse with shocking speed when conditions align. The late Bronze Age world seemed stable, wealthy, and permanent. Kings exchanged letters as brothers. Trade networks functioned smoothly for centuries. Cities were prosperous and well-defended. Then, in the span of 2 or 3 generations, most of it was gone. Second, we've learned that complexity creates both strength and vulnerability. The interconnected Bronze Age system allowed for specialization, efficiency, and prosperity. Cyprus could focus on copper production because it could import grain from Egypt. Egypt could focus on grain production because it could import timber from Lebanon. But this interconnection meant that disruption in one area cascaded through the entire system. When drought affected everyone simultaneously, the trade-based adaptation that normally worked couldn't function. Modern scholars talk about network resilience versus network vulnerability. The same connections that make a system efficient in normal times can transmit shocks rapidly during crises. Third, we've learned that environmental stress alone isn't usually fatal. Bronze Age societies had survived droughts before. What makes the difference is whether a society has the resources, flexibility, and social cohesion to adapt. The drought that struck around 1250 BCE was severe, but it was the combination, drought plus earthquakes plus internal weakness plus warfare plus systems that were optimized for efficiency rather than resilience, that proved fatal. Fourth, We've learned that archaeological science can reconstruct ancient catastrophes in remarkable detail. Tree rings tell us about climate. Isotope analysis reveals diet and health. Destruction layers preserve moments in time. Texts, those final letters from kings, give us voices from the collapse. The Bronze Age collapse isn't speculation. It's documented in multiple independent lines of evidence that converge on a clear picture. Something catastrophic happened, and we can trace its progression with surprising precision. And fifth, perhaps most importantly, we've learned that civilizational collapse, while catastrophic for those who experience it, isn't necessarily permanent. The Mediterranean world recovered. New civilizations emerged. Knowledge was rebuilt, sometimes in better forms. The alphabet that emerged from the collapse was simpler and more accessible than Bronze Age writing systems. Iron technology was more democratic than bronze. The political forms that emerged, city-states, merchant republics, tribal kingdoms, proved more adaptable than palace bureaucracies. Progress isn't linear. Sometimes systems have to break completely before new, better systems can emerge. But, and this is important, the people who lived through the collapse paid an enormous price. Populations declined. Knowledge was lost. Lives were disrupted or ended. The fact that future generations eventually built something new doesn't diminish the suffering of those who experienced the catastrophe. So what does this ancient collapse tell us about modern civilization? The parallels are uncomfortable. We live in a highly interconnected world where disruption in one region affects the entire globe. Just-in-time supply chains are efficient but fragile. Climate change is stressing agricultural systems. Complex financial networks can transmit shocks rapidly. Migration pressures are increasing. We're not in exactly the same situation as the late Bronze Age. Our technology is different, our resources are different, our political systems are different. But the fundamental pattern of interconnection, creating both opportunity and vulnerability, is similar. The Bronze Age collapse teaches us that complexity requires active management and resilience planning. Environmental stress is a threat. Multiplier that makes other problems worse. Systems optimized for efficiency may be vulnerable to shocks. Early warning signs, labor unrest, piracy, regional conflicts, should be taken seriously. Diversification and decentralization provide resilience that centralization doesn't. Recovery is possible, but can take generations. We can't prevent all crises, but we can build systems that are more resilient when crises hit. Systems that have redundancy, that can adapt, that don't collapse completely when one component fails. The Bronze Age kingdoms didn't know their world would collapse. The people writing those final letters from Ugarit and Hattusa expected their civilizations would continue. They thought help would come. They thought the systems that had worked for centuries would keep working. They were wrong. We have the advantage of historical perspective. We can see what happened when complex civilizations faced multiple simultaneous stresses. We can learn from their failures. Whether we will learn is a different question. The ruins of Hattusa still stand in central Turkey. Massive walls, empty gates, collapsed buildings. Tourists visit them now, taking pictures of architecture that once housed a superpower. Ugarit is an archaeological site, its streets and houses excavated, its tablets displayed in museums. These weren't primitive societies that fell because they lacked knowledge or technology. They were sophisticated civilizations that collapsed because complex systems, when stressed, beyond their adaptive capacity, can fail catastrophically. It happened before. It could happen again. But unlike the Bronze Age kingdoms, we know this. We've seen what collapse looks like. We understand the warning signs. The question is, what will we do with that knowledge? And that's the story of the Bronze Age collapse, the catastrophe that ended the ancient world's first great era of globalization and changed the course of Mediterranean history. If you made it this far, thank you for exploring this complex and somewhat sobering topic. Understanding how civilizations fail is just as important as understanding how they succeed. If you found this deep dive into archaeological detective work and systems collapse valuable, subscribe to the channel. We explore these kinds of overlooked historical patterns regularly, examining what archaeology reveals about how human societies work. Leave a comment. Did you know the Bronze Age world was this interconnected? Do the parallels to a modern civilization concern you? What other ancient catastrophes should we investigate? Until next time.